Hello, everybody. I'm glad we're together again. I'm looking forward to reading this next chapter to you, and I hope you're looking forward to hearing it too. Because, as you know, Eustace has been turned into a dragon, and his arm hurts, and we know that he's flown down onto the beach where the children and the crew of the Dawntraitor are, and Lucy has put one drop of her magic cordial on his so swollen arm, and the swelling went down, but as you remember, it didn't dissolve the gold. But now they don't know who this is that they've got there with this funny golden bracelet on his arm. So let's read what happens next. How the adventure ended, chapter 7. "Look at that," said Edmund. "Look at the device on the gold," said Caspian. "It's a little hammer with a diamond above it like a star. I believe I've seen that before." "Seen it?" said Caspian. "Why, of course you have seen it. It's the sign of a great Narnian house. This is the Lord Optician's arm ring." "You villain," said Reepicheep to the dragon. "Have you devoured a Narnian lord?" But the dragon shook his head violently. "Or perhaps," said Lucy, "this is the Lord Optician turned into a dragon and is under an enchantment, you know." "Oh, it needn't be either," said Edmund. "All dragons collect gold, but I think it's a safe bet that Optician got no further than this island." "Are you the Lord Optician?" said Lucy to the dragon. And then when it sadly shook his head, she said, "Are you someone enchanted, though? Someone human, I mean?" He nodded violently. And then someone said, people disputed afterwards whether it was Lucy or Edmund, said, "You're not Eustace by any chance, are you?" And Eustace nodded his terrible dragon head and thumped his tail in the sea. And everyone jumped back to avoid the enormous boiling tears that flowed from his eyes. Lucy tried hard to console him and even screwed up her courage to kiss his scaly face. And everyone said, "Oh, bad luck." And several assured Eustace that they would all stand by him and said many things that tried to disenchant him, and they'd have him right and rain in a day or two, they hoped. And of course, they were all very anxious to hear his story too, but he couldn't talk. More than once in the days that followed, he attempted to write it for them on the sand, but this never really succeeded. In the first place, Eustace, having never read the right books, had no idea how to tell a story straight. And, for another thing, the muscles and the nerves of his dragon claws that he had never learned to write, and were not built for writing anyway. As a result, he never got near to the end of it before the tide would come up and wash away all the writing, except the bits that he had accidentally trodden on or accidentally swished out with his tail in any case there was nothing there to see. And all that anybody could ever make out were just a few odd words. And the words looked like this. I'll show it. I'll hold it up for you to read. Can you see that? It says, I'll just let you look at it for a second or two. It's a little hard to read, but I'll do my best. "I went to sleep, Dragon's cave, because it was dead and raining so hard. I woke up and couldn't get it off my arm. Oh, bother." It was, however, clear to everyone that Eustace's character had been improving by becoming a dragon. He was anxious to help. He flew over the whole island and found that it was all mountainous and inhabited only by wild goats and droves of wild swine. Of these, he brought back many a carcass as provisions for the ship. He was a very humane killer, too, for he could kill an animal with one blow of his tail so that it didn't even know that it had been killed. He ate a few of them himself, of course, but he did that alone, for since he was a dragon, he liked to eat his food raw, and he couldn't bear to let the others see him eating his messy meals. And one day, flying slowly and wearily, but in great triumph, he bore back to camp a great tall pine tree, which he had torn up by the roots from a distant valley, and which would be made into a first-class mast. And in the evening, if it turned chilly, as it sometimes did after heavy rains, he was a comfort to everyone, for the whole party could come and sit with their backs against his hot sides and get well warmed and dried. And one puff of his fiery breath would light the most obstinate fire. Sometimes he would select a few of them to fly on his back, so that they could see, curling down below them, the green slopes, the rocky heights, the narrow pit-like valleys, and far out over to the sea to the east, a spot of darker blue on the horizon that might be land. The pleasure, quite new to him, of being liked, and still more of liking other people, was what kept Eustace from complete despair. For it was very weary being a dragon. He shuddered whenever he caught sight of his own reflection as he flew over a mountain lake. He hated those huge bat-like wings, the saw-ridged back, and the cruel curved claws. He was almost afraid to be alone with himself, and yet he was ashamed to be with the others. On the evenings when he was not being used as a hot water bottle, he would slink away from the camp and lie curled up like a snake between the wood and the water. On such occasions, much to his surprise, Reepicheep was his most constant comforter. The noble mouse would creep away from the merry circle at the campfire and sit down by the dragon's head, well to the windward to be out of the range of his smoky breath. And there he would explain that what had happened to Eustace was a striking illustration of the turn of fortune's wheel, and that if he had Eustace at his own house in Narnia, it really was actually a hole and not a house, the dragon's head, let alone his body, would not have fitted in. He could show him more than 100 examples of emperors, kings, dukes, knights, poets, lovers, astronomers, philosophers, and magicians who had fallen from prosperity into the most distressing circumstances, and most of whom had recovered and lived happily ever after. It didn't seem so much comfort at the time, but it was kindly meant, and Eustace never forgot it. But of course, what hung over everybody like a cloud was the problem with what to do with their dragon when they were ready to sail. They tried not to talk about it while he was there, but he couldn't help overhearing things like, would he fit all along one side of the deck? We'd have to ship all the stores to the other side down below so as to balance him. Or would towing him be any good? Or would he be able to keep up with us by flying? And most often of all, how are we going to feed him? And poor Eustace realized more and more that since the first day he came on board, he had been an unmitigated nuisance, and he was now an even bigger nuisance. And this ate into his mind, just as the bracelet had eaten into his foreleg. He knew that it only made it worse to tear at it with his big teeth, but he couldn't help tearing at it now and then, especially on hot nights. About 6 days after they had landed on Dragon Island, Edmund happened to wake up very early one morning. It was just getting gray so that you could see the tree trunks as if they were between you and the bay, but not in the other direction. And as he woke, he thought he heard something moving. So he raised himself up on one elbow and looked around him. And presently he thought he saw a dark figure moving on the seaward side of the wood. And the idea that at once occurred to his mind was, are we sure that there are no natives on this island? Then he thought it was Caspian. It was about the right size as Caspian, but he knew that Caspian had been sleeping beside him and could see that he hadn't moved. Edmund made sure that his sword was in place, and he rose to investigate it. He came down softly to the edge of the wood, and the dark figure was still there. He saw now that it was too small to be Caspian, and too big to be Lucy, and it didn't run away. Edmund drew his sword, and was about to challenge the stranger, when the stranger said in a low voice, "Is that you, Edmund?" "Yes, who are you?" he said. "Don't you know me?" said the other. "It's me, Eustace." "By Jove," said Edmund, "so it is. My dear chap." "Hush," said Eustace, and lurched as if he were going to fall. "Hello," said Edmund, steadying him. "What's up? Are you ill?" Eustace was silent for so long that Edmund thought he was fainting. But at last he said, It's been ghastly. You don't know, but it's all right now. Could we go and talk somewhere? I don't want to meet the others just yet. Oh, yes, of course, anywhere you like, said Edmund. We can go sit on those rocks over there. I say I am glad to see you looking yourself again. You must have had a pretty beastly time. They went to the rocks and sat looking out across the bay while the sky got paler and paler, and the stars disappeared except for one bright one very low down and near the horizon. I won't tell you how I became a dragon until I can tell the others and get it all over, said Eustace. By the way, I didn't even know it was a dragon until I heard you all using the words when I turned up there that morning. I want to tell you, though, how I stopped being one. Fire away, said Edmund. Well, last night I was more miserable than ever, and that beastly arm ring was hurting like anything. Is that all right now? And Eustace laughed, a different kind of laugh from any that Eustace had ever done before, and he slipped the bracelet easily off his arm. There it is, he said, and anyone who likes can have it as far as I'm concerned. Well, as I say, I was lying awake and wondering what on earth would become of me. And then, mind you, it might have all been a dream. I don't know. Go on, said Edmund with considerable patience. Well, anyway, I looked up and saw the very last thing I expected, a huge lion coming toward me. And one queer thing was that there was no moon that night, but there was moonlight where the lion was. So it came nearer and nearer. I was terribly afraid of it. You may think that being a dragon, I could knock off any lion easily enough, but it wasn't that kind of fear. I wasn't afraid of it eating me. I was just afraid of it, if you can understand. Well, it came up close to me and looked straight in my eyes. And I shut my eyes tight, but that wasn't any good because it told me to follow it. You mean it spoke? I don't know. Now that you mention, I don't think it did, but it told me all the same. And I knew I'd have to do it. And so I got up and I followed it. And it led me a long way into the mountains. And there was always this moonlight over and around the lion wherever we went. So at last we came to the top of a mountain I'd never seen before. And on the top of this mountain, there was a garden, trees and fruit and everything. And in the middle of it, there was a well. I knew it was a well because you could see water bubbling up from the bottom of it, but it was a lot bigger than most wells, like a very big round pool with marble steps going down into it. The water was as clear as anything, and I thought that if I could get in there and bathe, it would ease the pain in my leg. But the lion told me I must undress first. Mind you, I don't know if he said it in those words or not. And I was just going to say that I couldn't undress because I didn't have any clothes on, when suddenly I thought, dragons are snaky kinds of things, and snakes can shed their skins. Oh, of course, thought I. That's what the lion means. So I started scratching myself, and my scales began coming off all over the place. And then I scratched a little deeper. And instead of just scales coming off here and there, my whole skin peeled off beautifully, like it does after an illness, or as if I were a banana. In a minute or two, I just stepped out of it. I could see it lying there beside me, looking rather nasty. It was the most lovely feeling. So I started to go down into the well for my bathe. But just as I was going to put my feet into the water, I looked down and saw that they were just as hard and rough and wrinkled and scaly as they had been before. Oh, well, that's all right, I said. It only means that I have a smaller skin underneath the first one, and I'll have to get out of it too. So I scratched and tore again, and this underskin peeled off beautifully, and I stepped out and left it lying beside the other one and went down to the well for my bath. Well, exactly the same thing happened again. And I thought to myself, oh dear, however many skins do I have to take off? For I was longing to bathe my leg. So I scratched away for the third time and got off a third skin just like the other two and stepped out of it. But as soon as I looked at myself in the water, I knew it had been no good. Then the lion said, but I don't know if it spoke, you have to let me undress you. and I was afraid of his claws, I can tell you. But I was pretty nearly desperate now, so I just lay flat on my back and let him do it. The very first tear he made was so deep that I thought he had gone right down to my heart. And when he began pulling the skin off, it hurt worse than anything I've ever felt. The only thing that made me able to bear it was just the pleasure of feeling the stuff peel off. Well, he peeled the beastly stuff right off, just as I thought I'd been doing myself the other 3 times, only they hadn't hurt, and there it was, lying on the grass, only ever so much thicker and darker and more knobbly looking than the others had been. And there I was, smooth and soft as a peeled stick of wood, and smaller than I had been. Then he caught hold of me. I didn't like that much, for I was very tender underneath now that I had no skin on, and he threw me into the water. It stung like anything, but only for a moment. And after that it became perfectly delicious. And as soon as I started swimming and splashing, I found that all the pain had gone from my arm. And then I saw why. I had turned back into a boy again. You would think I was simply phony if I told you how I felt about my own arms. I know they've got no muscle and they're pretty moldy compared with Caspian's, but I was so glad to see them. And after a bit, the lion took me out and dressed me. Dressed you with his paws? Well, I don't exactly remember that bit, but he did somehow or other, in new clothes, same ones I've got on now, as a matter of fact. And then suddenly I was back here, which is what makes me think it must have been a dream. No, it wasn't a dream, said Edmund. Why not? Well, there are the clothes for one thing, and you've been undragoned for another. What do you think it was then? Said Eustace. Said Eustace. I think you have seen Aslan, said Edmund. Aslan, said Eustace. I've heard that name mentioned several times since we joined the Dawn Treader, and I don't know what, I felt then that I hated it, but I was hating everything then. And by the way, I would like to apologize. I'm afraid I've been pretty beastly. That's all right, said Edmund. Between ourselves, you haven't been nearly as bad as I was on my first trip to Narnia. You were only acting beastly, but I was a traitor. Well, don't tell me about it then, said Eustace, but who is Aslan? Do you know him? Well, he knows me, said Edmund. He's the great lion, the son of the Emperor beyond the sea, who saved me and saved Narnia. We've all seen him. Lucy sees him most often, and it may be Aslan's country that we're sailing to. Neither of them said anything for a while. The last bright star had vanished, and though they couldn't see the sunrise yet because of the mountains on their right, they knew it was going on because the sky above them and the bay turned the color of roses. Then some bird of the parrot kind screeched in the wood behind them, and they heard movement among the trees, and finally a blast on Caspian's horn. The camp was astir. Great was the rejoicing when Edmund and the restored Eustace walked into the breakfast circle around the campfire. And now everyone heard the earlier part of Eustace's story. People wondered whether the other dragon had killed the Lord Octesian several years ago, or whether Octesian himself had been the old dragon. The jewels with which Eustace had crammed his pockets in the cave had disappeared, along with the clothes he had been wearing then, but no one, least of all Eustace himself, felt any desire to go back to that valley for more treasure. In a few days now, the Dawn Treader, remasted, repainted, and well stored, was ready to sail. Before they embarked, Caspian caused to be engraved on a smooth cliff facing the bay the words, Dragon Island, discovered by Caspian X, King of Narnia, in the 4th year of his reign. Here, as we suppose, the Lord Octesian met his death. It would be nice and fairly true to say that from that time forth, Eustace was a different boy. To be strictly accurate, he began to be a different boy. He had relapses. But there were still many days when he could be very tiresome, but most of the time we won't notice because the cure had begun. The Lord Octesian's armoring had a curious fate. Eustace didn't want it, and he offered it to Caspian. and Caspian offered it to Lucy. She didn't want it. And then Caspian said, well, then we'll throw it up in the air and see who catches it. And he flung it up high. And while they were all standing looking at it, up went the ring, flashing in the sunlight, and it caught and hung on a little projection on the rock. No one could climb up there to get it, and no one could climb down to get it from above. And there, for all I know, it's hanging still, and may hang there still till the end of the worlds. So here's the bracelet. Can you see it right there, hanging on the little projection of rock way up on the cliff face? And that's the end of chapter 7. And wasn't that a wonderful picture of how it is when the Lord Jesus saves us? We can try all kinds of things to make ourselves better. We think we're peeling off a layer of skin like Eustace did, and that now we're going to be right. Now Jesus will love us because we've gotten rid of this and that. But before we know it, we're just back to where we were before. And maybe now I'll try a little harder, and I'll see if I can do something to please Jesus. And pretty soon we're just back to where we were. And Jesus is saying to us, I must change you. I must change you and give you a new heart. I must completely peel away all that old you and give you a brand new you that will love me and serve me, and you'll be changed just as Eustace was changed from being a dragon into being a boy again. And so when the Lord Jesus saves us, he does a wonderful work inside us so that all the things we loved before, we don't love them anymore. We love him now. All the bad things we used to think and say and do, we don't want to do those things anymore. It's not instant transformation. It's kind of like Eustace. We are a new person, all right, but we may have relapses. We may find ourselves slipping back. But by Jesus' power and strength and reading our Bible and praying and asking for help from the Holy Spirit, we can get more and more like him, like Jesus. And that's what's going to happen to Eustace. He's getting a little better every day. What a wonderful story that is. I love it. All right, let's read chapter 8 now. 2 narrow escapes. Everyone was cheerful as the Dawn Treaders sailed from Dragon Island. They had fair winds as soon as they were out of the bay and came early the next morning to an unknown land, which some of them had seen when flying over the mountains while Eustace was still a dragon. It was a low green island inhabited by nothing but rabbits and a few goats. But from the ruins of stone huts and from blackened places where campfires had been, they judged that people not long before had lived there. And there were also some bones and broken weapons. Pirates' work, said Caspian. Or dragons' work, said Edmund. The only other thing they found there was a little skin boat or a coracle on the sands. It was made of hide, that's leather, stretched over a wicker framework. It was a tiny boat, barely 4 feet long, and the paddle which lay in it was in proportion. A coracle is a little round boat. It looks just like a big, shallow flower basket made out of wicker, but it has a leather covering on it to keep it waterproof and a little paddle in it. But since it's perfectly round usually, it's tricky to steer. It doesn't have a point on the front of it like boats that we're used to. And this was just a small one, only 4 feet across. They thought that either it had been made for a child or else the people of that country had been dwarfs. Reepicheep decided to keep it. It was just the right size for him, so it was taken on board. They called that land Burnt Island and sailed away before noon. Some 5 days later, they ran into a south-southeast wind out of sight of all the lands, and they saw neither fish nor gulls. Then they had a day that rained hard till the afternoon. Eustace lost 2 games of chess to Reepicheep and began to be like his old disagreeable self again. And Edmund said they wished they could have gone to America with Susan. And then Lucy looked out of the windows and said, "Hello, I do believe it's stopping, and what is that?" They all tumbled out onto the deck at this time and found that the rain had stopped, and that Drinian, who was also at watch, was also staring hard at something astern. Or rather, several things. They looked like little smooth, rounded rocks, a whole line of them, with intervals of about 40 feet in between. So it was little humps in the water. But they can't be rocks, Drinian was saying, because they weren't there 5 minutes ago. And one of them just disappeared. And look, there's another one coming up. Yes, and it's getting nearer, said Eustace. Hang it, the whole thing is moving this way, said Caspian. And moving a great deal faster than we can sail, said Drinian. It'll be up with us in a minute. They held their breath, for it is not at all nice to be pursued by some unknown something on either land or sea. But what it turned out to be was far worse than anybody had suspected. Suddenly, only about the length of a football field from their port side, an appalling head reared itself out of the sea. It was all green and orange with purple blotches, except where shellfish clung to it, and shaped rather like a horse's, though without any ears. It had enormous eyes, meant for staring through the dark depths of the ocean, and a gaping mouth filled with double rows of sharp, fish-like teeth. It came up on what they took to be a huge neck, but as more and more of it emerged, everyone knew that this was not just the neck, but the whole body of what so many people have so foolishly wanted to see, a sea serpent. The folds of its gigantic tail could be seen far away, rising at intervals from the surface, and now its head was towering up higher than the mast. Every man rushed to his weapon, but there was nothing to be done. The monster was out of reach. Shoot, shoot, cried the master bowman, and several obeyed, but the arrows glanced off the sea serpent's hide as if it was plated with iron. Then, for a dreadful minute, everyone was still, staring up at its eyes and its mouth and wondering when it was going to pounce. But it didn't pounce. It shot its head forward across the ship on a level with the mast, and now its head was just beside the fighting top. Still it stretched and stretched until its head was over the whole ship, and then down it began to come, not onto the crowded deck, but into the water, so that the whole ship was under the arch of the serpent. And almost at once, that arch began to get smaller. Indeed, on the starboard, the sea serpent was almost now touching the Dawn Treader's side. Eustace, who really had been trying hard to behave well till the rain and chest put him back, now did the first brave thing he had ever done in his life. He was wearing a sword that Caspian had lent him, and as soon as the serpent's body was near enough on the starboard side, he jumped onto the side of the ship and began hacking at it with all its might. It is true that he accomplished nothing beyond breaking Caspian's second-best sword into bits, but it was a fine thing for a beginner to have done. Others would have joined him at that moment if Reepicheep had not called out, "Don't fight! Push!" It was so unusual for the mouse to advise anyone not to fight that even in that terrible moment, every eye turned to him. And when he jumped up onto the side of the ship, ahead of the snake, and set his little furry back against its huge, scaly, slimy back and began pushing as hard as he could, quite a number of people saw what he meant and rushed to both sides of the ship to do the same. And when a moment later the sea serpent's head appeared again, this time on the port side, and this time with its back to them, everyone understood. The brute had made a loop of itself around the Dawn Treader and was beginning to draw the loop tighter. When it got quite tight, snap, there would just be floating mashwood where the ship had been, and he could pick the people out of the water one by one. Their only chance was to push the loop backward till it slid over the stern, or else, to put the same thing another way, to push the ship forward out of the loop. Reepicheep alone, of course, had no more chance of doing this than lifting up a cathedral, but he nearly killed himself with trying before others shoved him aside. Very soon, the whole ship's company, except Lucy and the mouse, who was fainting, was in two long lines along the two bulwarks, the sides of the ship, each man's chest to the back of the man in front, so that the weight of the whole line was in the last man pushing for all their lives. For a few sickening seconds, which seemed like hours, nothing seemed to happen. Joints cracked, sweat dropped, breath came in grunts and gasps. Then it felt as if the ship was moving. and they saw that the snake loop was further from the mast than it had been. But they also saw that it was smaller. Now the real danger was at hand. Could they get it up over the poop deck? Or was it already too tight? Yes, it would just fit. It was resting on the poop rails now. A dozen more sprung up on the poop deck, and this was better. The sea serpent's body was so low now that they could make a line across the poop deck and push it side by side. Hope rose high until everyone remembered the high, carved stern, the dragon's tail of the Dawn Treader. It would be very impossible to get the brute over that. "An axe!" cried Caspian hoarsely, "and still shove." Lucy, who knew where everything was, heard him where she was standing, and in a few seconds she had gone below, gotten the axe, and was rushing up the ladder. But just as she came to the top, there was a great crashing sound, like a tree coming down, and the ship rocked and darted forward. For at that very moment, whether because the sea serpent was being pushed so hard or because it foolishly decided to draw its noose tighter, the whole of the carved stern broke off, and the ship was free. The others were too exhausted to see what Lucy saw. There, a few yards behind them, the loop of the sea serpent's body got rapidly smaller and disappeared into a splash. Lucy always said, but of course she was very excited at the moment, and it may only have been in her imagination, that she saw a look of idiotic satisfaction on the sea serpent's face. What is certain was that it was a very stupid animal, for instead of chasing the ship, it turned its head around and began nosing all along its own body as if it expected to find the wreckage of the Dawn Treader somewhere there. But the Dawn Treader was already well away, running before a fresh breeze, and the men lay and sat, panting and groaning all about the deck, till presently they were able to talk about it and then even laugh about it a little. And when some rum had been served out, they even raised a cheer, and everyone praised the valor of Eustace, although it hadn't done any good, and of Reepicheep. After this, they sailed for 3 days more, and saw nothing but sea and sky. On the 4th day, the wind changed to the north, and the seas began to rise. By the afternoon, it had nearly become a gale. But at the same time, they sighted land on their port bow. "By your leave," said Drinian, "we will try to get under the lee of that country by rowing and lie in the harbor until this storm is over." And Caspian agreed, but it was a long row against a gale, and it didn't bring them to the land until evening. By the last light of that day, they steered into a natural harbor and anchored, but no one went ashore that night. In the morning, they found themselves in the green bay of a rugged, lonely-looking country which sloped up to a rocky summit. From the windy north beyond the summit, clouds came streaming rapidly. They lowered the lifeboat and loaded her with any of the water casks which were now empty. "Which stream shall we water at, Drinian?" said Caspian, as he took his seat in the back of the boat. "There seem to be 2 coming down into the bay." "Makes little difference, sire," said Drinian, "but I think it's a shorter row to that one over on the starboard side, the eastern one." "Here comes the rain," said Lucy. "Wow, it sure is," said Edmund, for it was pelting hard. "I say let's go to the other stream. There are trees there, and we'll have some shelter." "Oh, yes," said Eustace, "no point in getting wetter than we need." But all the time, Drinian was steadily steering to the starboard, like tiresome people in cars who keep going 40 miles an hour when you're explaining to them that they're on the wrong road. "They're right, Drinian," said Caspian. "Why don't you turn around and make for the western stream?" "As you please," said Drinian a little shortly. He had had an anxious day with the weather yesterday, and he didn't like advice from landlubbers. But he altered the course, and it turned out later that it was a good thing that he did. By the time they had finished filling up the water casks, the rain was over, and Caspian, with Eustace, Vivenses, and Reepicheep, decided to walk up to the top of the hill and see what could be seen. It was rather a stiffish climb through coarse grass and heather, and they saw neither man nor beast, except seagulls, and when they reached the top, they saw that it was a very small island, not more than 20 acres in size, and from this height The sea looked larger and more desolate than it did from the deck. Crazy, you know, said Eustace to Lucy in a low voice, looking at the eastern horizon, sailing on and on into that, with no idea what we might get to. But he only said that out of habit, not nearly as nastily as he would have done at one time. It was too cold to stay up there on the ridge, for the wind blew freshly from the north. Don't let's go back the same way, said Lucy. Let's go along a bit and come down by the other stream, the one Drinian wanted us to go down to. Everyone agreed to this, and after about 15 minutes, they were at the source of the second river. It was a much more interesting place than they had expected, a deep little mountain lake, surrounded by cliffs, except for a narrow channel on the seaward side, out of which the water flowed. Here at last they were out of the wind, and they all sat down in the heather above the cliff for a rest. Everyone sat down but one. It was Edmund, who jumped up again very quickly. That's sure as a sharp stone on this island, he said, groping about in the heather. What is this wretched thing? Now I've got it. Hello, this isn't a stone at all. It's a sword hilt. No, by Jove, it's a whole sword. What the rust is left of it, it must have lain here for ages. And it's Narnian, too, by the look of it, said Caspian, as they all crowded around. I'm sitting on something, too, said Lucy, something hard, and it turned out to be the remains of a mail shirt. By this time, everyone was on hands and knees, feeling in the thick heather in every direction. And their search revealed, one by one, a helmet, a dagger, a few coins, not Kellerman crescents, but genuine Narnian lions and trees, such you might see any day in the marketplace at Beaver's Dam or Baruna. It looks like this might be all that's left of one of the 7 lords, said Edmund. Just what I was thinking, said Caspian. I wonder which one it was. There's nothing on the dagger to show, and I wonder, how did he die? And how are we to avenge him, said Reepicheep. Edmund, the only one of the party who had read several detective stories, had meanwhile been thinking. Look here, he said. There's something very fishy about this. He can't have been killed in a fight. Why not, said Caspian. There's no bones here. An enemy might take his armor and leave the body, but who ever heard of someone who'd been fighting carrying away the body and leaving the armor? Maybe he was killed by a wild animal, Lucy suggested. Must be a clever animal that knows how to take a chainmail shirt off. Perhaps a dragon, said Caspian. Nothing doing, said Eustace. A dragon couldn't do it. I ought to know. Well, let's get away from this place anyway. She did not feel like sitting down again since Edmund had raised the questions of bones. If you like, said Caspian, getting up. I don't think any of this stuff is really worth taking away. They came down and around to the little opening where the stream came out of the lake, and looking into the deep water within the circle of cliffs. If it had been a hot day, no doubt someone would have been tempted to dive in and bathe, and everyone would have had a drink. Indeed, even as it was, Eustace was on the very point of stooping down and scooping up some water in his hands when Reepicheep and Lucy both at the same moment said, Look! So he forgot about his drink and looked into the water. The bottom of the pool was made of large, grayish-blue stones, and the water was perfectly clear, and on the bottom lay a life-sized figure of a man, apparently made of gold. It lay face downward, with its arms stretched out above its head, and so it happened that as they looked at it, the clouds parted and the sun shone. The golden shape was lit up from end to end. Lucy thought it was the most beautiful statue she had ever seen. Well, whistled Caspian, that was worth coming to see. I wonder if we can get it out. We could dive for it, sir, said Reepicheep. No good at all, said Edmund. At least if it's really gold, solid gold, it'd be far too heavy for us to bring up. And that pool is 12 to 15 feet deep if it's an inch. Half a moment, though. It's a good thing I've brought my hunting spear with me. Let's see what the depth is like. Hold on to my hand, Caspian, while I lean out over the water a bit. Caspian took his hand, and Edmund, leaning forward, began to lower his spear into the water. But before it was in halfway, Lucy said, I don't believe the statue is gold at all. It's just a light, because your spear looks exactly the same color. What's wrong? Asked several voices at once, for Edmund suddenly let go of the spear. I couldn't hold it any more, said Edmund. It was so heavy. Here they all are. And Edmund is just lowering his spear down into the water. And there it is on the bottom right now, and Lucy is right. It looks just the same color as the statue. But Edmund, who seemed to be having some trouble with his boots, at least he was bending down and looking at them, straightened himself up at once and shouted out in a sharp voice which people hardly ever disobey, Get back! Get back from the water, all of you! Get back at once! They all did and stared at him. Look, said Edmund, look at the toes of my boots. They look a bit yellow, said Eustace. They're gold, solid gold, said Edmund. Look at them, feel them. The leather has pulled away from it already, and they're heavy as lead. By Aslan, said Caspian, you don't mean to say. Yes, I do, said Edmund. That water turns things to gold. It turned the spear to gold, and that's why it got so heavy. And it was just lapping at my feet, and it's a good thing I wasn't barefoot, and it turned the toe caps into gold. And that poor fellow at the bottom, well, you see. So it isn't a statue at all, said Lucy in a low voice. No, the whole thing is plain now. He was here on a hot day. He undressed on top of the cliff where we're sitting. The clothes have rotted away or been taken by birds to line their nests with. The armor is still there, and he dived in, and don't, said Lucy. Oh, what a horrible thing. And what a narrow shave we've had, said Edmund. Narrow indeed, said Reepicheep. Anyone's finger, anyone's foot, whisker or tail might have dipped into the water at any moment. All the same, said Caspian, we may as well test it. He stooped down and wrenched up a spray of heather. And then very cautiously, he knelt down beside the pool and dipped it in. It was heather he dipped. What he drew out was a perfectly solid gold model of heather, heavy and soft as lead. The king who owned this island, said Caspian slowly, and his face flushed as he spoke, would soon be the richest of all the kings in the world. I claim this island forever as a Narnian possession. It shall be called Goldwater Island, and I bind all of you to secrecy. No one must know about this, not even Drinian, on pain of death. Do you hear? Who are you talking to? Said Edmund. I'm no subject of yours. If anything, it's the other way around. I am one of the 4 ancient sovereigns of Narnia, and you are under allegiance to the High King, my brother. So it has come to that, King Edmund, has it? Said Caspian, laying his hand on his sword hilt. Oh, stop it, both of you, said Lucy. That's the worst of doing anything with boys. You're always swaggering and bullying, and you're idiots. Oh! And her voice died away in a gasp, because everyone saw what she had seen. Across the gray hillside above them, gray for the heather was not yet in bloom, without noise and without looking at them, and shining as though he were in bright sunlight, though in fact the sun had gone in, passed with a slow pace the largest lion anyone had ever seen. In describing the scene afterwards, Lucy said he was the size of an elephant, though at another time she only said the size of a cart horse. But it was not the size that mattered. Nobody dared ask what it was. They knew it was Aslan. And nobody ever saw how or where he went, but they looked at one another like people waking from sleep. What were we talking about? Said Caspian. Have I been making rather a fool of myself? Sire, said Reepicheep, this is a place with a curse on it. Let us get back on board at once. And if I may have the honor of naming this island, I would like to call it Deathwater Island. That strikes me as a very good name, Reep, said Caspian, though now I come to think of it, I don't know why, but the weather seems to be settling, and I dare say Drinian would like to be off. What a lot we shall have to tell him. But in fact, they didn't have much to tell him, because the memory of the last hour had become all confused. Their Majesties all seemed a bit confused, a bit bewitched when they came on board, Drinian said to Rince a few hours later, when the Dawn Treader was once more under sail, and Deathwater Island was already below the horizon. Something happened to them in that place. The only thing I could get clear was that they think they found the body of one of the lords they've been searching for. You don't say so, Captain, said Rince. Well, that's 3 then, only 4 more. At this rate, we might be home soon after the new year. And a good thing, too. My tobacco is running a bit low. Good night, sir. And good night to you. That's the end of chapter 8. Wow, that was a blockbuster of a chapter, wasn't it? I'm so glad we can read these things together. I'm having a wonderful time doing it, and I hope you are too. And wasn't that an interesting discovery that they made, that when they were faced with the opportunity of turning everything to gold and becoming as rich as everything, it brought out the very worst in all of them, didn't it? At least the 2 boys, it did. But Aslan only had to show himself to remind them that earthly treasure is not what it's all about. Serving him is what it's all about. And they were freed from that greed and that sort of King Midas approach to life that unfortunately so many people have today. But anyway, we're learning lots of valuable lessons as we're reading through these books, aren't we? And it's fun too. So I'll see you tomorrow when we read chapters 9 and 10. Good night.